Okay, I think we're live. This is Journeys in Podcasting, and this is a midday edition. Today we'll be talking to Toby Emert, who has authored this book, Come Closer. I'm Chris Davis, and I'm 3 weeks into a sabbatical year, but I've been 20 years plus working in the classroom and doing projects. Very recently I've come to know Augusto Boal, and I'm fascinated by the classroom implications. Who else do we have here? Danielle, you want to jump in?
Yes. Hi, I'm Daniela Bertel. I am Peruvian, and I've been a drama teacher for the past 4.5 years or so. Before that, I've been an actress here, and I'm currently working on a Boal unit, and this is the second time that I'm doing it. And I came across when I was studying in college, and it's fascinating. I came across this book. For Rainbow and Desire, and I think it's a very powerful tool for kids in the classroom.
I'm not worried about the type. I'm worried about the...
That's my presentation of me.
Jacob, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, sure. Awesome. Hi, everybody. Really excited to be here for this. So I do a couple things that are very related to this topic. I'm here right now at Columbia College in Chicago, which is where I work, doing 21st century learning, both arts integration and digital media-based, project-based learning in classrooms in public schools here in Chicago. And then I also work with a collective of performers that makes theater about sexual health and sexual violence, and we use a lot of Boal-based techniques to start dialogue both with young people and with educators and violence prevention specialists who work with young people about how they can use theater as a tool to start some of those dialogues.
Hi, Lola. You want to jump in there?
Yes, my name is Lola. I'm a game designer, and I do work for kids as well. Right now I'm working in an education program for design and also animation. I've done couple of projects in animation and film, and I'm very interested. With some colleagues, we're working in participatory projects for any kind of media, so game design, film, television, and web design. So that's all.
And I'm Toby Emert. I am currently working as a professor in the Department of Education at a small private women's college in Atlanta, Georgia, in the U.S. And my background, though, is pretty traditional in a lot of ways. I studied education in theater and literature when I was in college, and then I spent several years as a classroom teacher and as an actor. And I didn't come to Boal's work until I was in graduate school doing my PhD, and it was a bit of a revelation because I was at that point in my life looking for an opportunity that would somehow combine a number of various what I would call threads of interest for me, things that were related to counseling and psychology, and things that were related to arts and theater, things that were related to learning and education, and also consciousness and awareness. So when I discovered Boal, actually I discovered Freire first, and then that led me to Boal's work, and I was, like you, Chris, I was wondering how it was that I had never been, introduced to this person and the work that he was doing before that moment, and I was pretty grateful to find that. So it's ultimately led to a lot of projects since then. That was about 10 years ago now.
In your chapter 5, Dramatizing Success of this book, Come Closer, which I'm going to keep holding up because it's pretty amazing, I want to kind of approach it through the structure of school itself, especially the physical structure. And you write that in your school, 3 dirt brown doors, the common entrance, confront faculty, staff, and students and visitors. But in stark contrast, stained glass panels designed by McRae students flank the doors. A winged dragon rises out on the left, and below the dragon, a rainbow mosaic spells out the school's name in pointy letters. The dissonance between the forbidding doors and the colorful bits of glass that surround them is a striking metaphor for this unique school. This immediately made me think of the book The Third Teacher and another book out of the D School called Make Space. And I'm thinking that within our schools we're constantly appropriating spaces, trying to make a student-centered pedagogy, but our hallways, classrooms, meeting spaces are often designed for a much different approach to learning. direct instruction, for example, and a measuring system based on individual production. What suggestions would you have for reappropriating space within schools to let the third teacher of environment reflect a more group-centered participatory learning?
So I think I might want to start by contextualizing what you just read for us a little bit and tell you a little bit about the project that that chapter describes and the children that I was working with, and also that school, because it was a really particular moment in the work that I was doing. So that school where I was doing the project was an alternative school, the only alternative school in the district that I was working in at the time. And the students who were in the school are all students who had, for some reason or in some way, been unsuccessful in whatever school they were in before they came to that school. And they'd all made a choice to come to the school. So the school was based on William Glasser's choice theory. So the idea is that the students are constantly being offered opportunities to make choices and understand the consequences of those choices. And so that school was specifically designed for those students. So it's a relatively small student population. On the other hand, the school looked very much like any other high school in the district and in most of the US at least, probably other parts of the world as well. And so we were in that project I was working with a particular teacher, and we were trying to help the students think more deeply about the choice that they had made to attend that school, the choice they had made to be in this particular class because they'd all chosen this English class they were in, and the choices that they were making about identity in the space of this alternative school that they were in. Okay, so that's a little bit of context for the project. The workshop that I was doing with them was a relatively short workshop. It was about 4 days, and it took place during they had an extended classroom, their extended class time for their English class, and it took place during their English class. They all elected to be part of the workshop. That was one of the choices that they had made. And there were a couple of students in the class who chose not to do the work with us. And we chose a room in the school that was not their classroom on purpose. So we chose it's kind of like a lounge space that had some windows in it. And that was purposeful on the part of the teacher and me to allow the students the opportunity to be out of sort of the traditional spot where they were in a lot, so that would essentially just sort of add to the work that we were doing together, which was extraordinarily out of the box for them. Like the image work, the kind of conversations that we were inviting them to have with us, that was not the kind of work that they were typically doing, even in the environment of this sort of alternative school that we're working in. So I think that was a purposeful choice on our part, but I think to get to your question, I think that this work has the potential. It's not built in naturally necessarily, but it has the potential to help us be extraordinarily conscious of all of the aspects of moments of education. So who we are in the space, who other folks are in the space with us, who the instructors are in the space with us, and also the space itself and how that's influencing who we are and what's happening to us. So I think it has the potential to help us create language that we may not necessarily have to begin to talk about that. That may not be an extraordinarily specific way of talking about it, but I think that is the potential in the work, Chris.
I'm going to leave a pause just in case someone else will jump in. I'm going to jump into another, and it has to do, this is a repeated theme. I think it's going to come up a lot in our talk, and it definitely comes up a lot in your writings, and it's the body as expressive modality. You open with a quote from Sarah, a 10th grade English student. She says, "It's weird how much emotion you can show with just your body and no words." And this really coincides with Boal's phases of introducing theater of the oppressed, the focus on the body as expressive form. And also what I understand is central to image theater, which I'm kind of new to. How does using the body as cognitive catalyst allow for a lower threshold for a risk-free environment for all learners? And why is this so successful in getting individuals and groups to reveal their thinking?
So I'll try to ground my answer in the chapter and in the work that I was doing with this particular group of students. So I'll go back to who they are. So these students were they were all 10th and 11th grade, like that age, and they were all students who had struggled in very particular ways to be successful. Although they were quite bright, there was no reason necessarily that they would that they would not have been successful in school, except that there were other circumstances that were prohibiting that in some way. And so I think in this case, we chose image theater, which is only one of Boal's modalities. He has several other ways of thinking about working. But we chose image theater because the students were quite verbal, generally, and they were pretty good at expressing themselves verbally. A lot of expressing displeasure in particular, discontent. And so we were interested to see what would happen if we asked them to observe themselves expressing some of the things that they were feeling or thinking without words, and then to add the language later. So the idea was that we would essentially sort of prime discussion or prime conversations about sort of phases of identity or elements of identity that they were working on as students within this particular setting, by asking them to represent some of the things that they were feeling or thinking, or situations. In some cases we even did like actual moments from their classroom. We thought that that would be a way to help them be more reflective and more conscious, and would ultimately give them language that they may not have had access to before. It would give them other words to begin to talk about some of the things that we thought were important to them if they were going to ultimately be successful. I should say that our sort of underlying theme for the work was success. That was a word that we were playing with in these workshops. Sort of how do we move toward it, and what was hindering them, or what was blocking them somehow from that.
Jacob, this makes me think of your workshop at South by Southwest, where in one of the activities you all really played with this idea of soft and hard focus, moving from sensory modality to sensory modality, focusing on just auditory elements of communication, focusing on just gestural elements of communication. Why is it that when we change the modality, it opens up more of a flow of expression?
I think it's because we get used to certain ways of interacting to the point that we take them for granted. And so if you're somebody who's very comfortable speaking, or speech is sort of the main way you communicate, it's easy to lose track of the vocabulary of your body. And in a lot of ways, our bodies can say things that our voices can't. One thing I always say when I talk about our work is that people sometimes go, well, oh, theater and sexuality, those are so very different. And they're actually not. And one of the ways in which they're not is that they both concern our bodies, and they both concern the way that we relate to other people. And I think one of the things that I appreciated about some of the reading that I was doing about this project that you mentioned, as well as sort of just any of this sort of liberatory pedagogy that you can read about. Bell Hooks writes about this, is this idea that we, in academia and education, we like to erase the body because we're afraid of it. We're afraid of desire, right, as a concept in the classroom. But we are, as humans, we are embodied creatures, and so we can't really divorce our minds from our bodies. And so all of a sudden, when you say you can't talk, you have to just make eye contact with somebody, all of a sudden all this vulnerability appears, and this awareness and this connection that's been there, it's been available, but we haven't been willing to access it. And so I think you talked about safety as well, that really requires the preparation, the skill building, the scaffolding of getting a group to a point where they're willing to go there because language is safer, because language is easier, and so asking us to embody things, we go deeper, but that has to be built too as well.
Toby, you talk about this idea of, in the beginning, in the first phase of the project, you have to demechanize the body in order to democratize the space. As I'm reading your chapter, I felt like William Kamkwamba. I don't know if you guys know the book, The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, but he finds a way to create a power generator with wind, and he doesn't even speak English. He just has a text in English with some diagrams, and then later, as he visits MIT, he asks, what is this Google? Where was that when I was trying to do my work? When I read this year, I couldn't believe the overlap with the new literacies that Henry Jenkins writes about, the ISTE student standards, which the new standards that were published this summer are much more expansive, 21st century learning skills. How Boal is one of the architects of what many of us hope is the future of learning. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this process of demechanization of the body and how that does open up a more democratized space.
So in this particular project, but in other projects I've worked on as well, we were aware that the students were very accustomed to the routines of the school. They were very accustomed to the routines of their classroom. They were very accustomed to the routines of language, all of those structures that are built around what we think of as education or learning now. And we thought that it would be interesting. That's sort of how we approached it, to offer them an opportunity to think of themselves in sort of an alternative way. And so even asking them to create an image, which is where we began with this particular work, of a word that they were extraordinarily familiar with, was a way of asking them to think about that word in a new way. So to demechanize, to release the way that we might normally connect with it. So it gets almost, I think Boal's idea of demechanization is enormous and extraordinarily powerful, but it has sort of the most fundamental kind of application in some ways to help us think about alternative ways, alternative perspectives of even the most tiny construct, like a particular word that we are really familiar with, a particular process, a particular activity, a particular moment that we're extraordinarily familiar with. When we recreate that, whatever it is, whatever that construct is, with the body, just the fact, just the natural work of recreation makes us already do the demechanization work. It takes us away from it and allows us to come back to it in a new way. And that's what we were interested to see, what would happen with these particular students. We didn't know necessarily, although it was pretty clear from reading Boal's work that when he and others have used his methods in all kinds of settings, that is one of the things that happens, that people do tend to learn something new, understand something in a different way, come to the world in a way that they might not have come to it before, which has the potential then to change the way we would come to the world the next time. And so we were interested to see if that would happen for these students. I should say also that one of the ways that we were bringing it back to them, which I don't think I said earlier, is we took photographs of everything that they were doing. And so we would process in the moment, but also several weeks later I went back to them with this series of photographs, and we looked at the photographs together and had a separate conversation where they're now no longer immediately in the moment of having just created something and responding to it, but now they're reflecting after several weeks of having the experience on what those photographs are saying about them. So when they look at themselves now in the photographs, it was a really interesting way for them to do that. That had never happened for them before.
I think it's really interesting how we talk about learning and how when you separate the body from just the speech, like when you talk about something, it's all in your brain, right? But when you separate them, you get to feel things and put yourself in different positions. And I think that the fact that you're putting yourself in a different positions allows you to understand the problem or the issue or whatever you're talking about from another perspective. And I think the learnings come from, okay, I'm not thinking, I'm feeling, and then you learn from those feelings, which allows you to have a lot more empathy. And I guess we all learn in different ways, right? So it's about how we have all of this variables for learning, which is not only in your mind, but also how you feel the world and how you react to the world. And you need to sometimes separate, okay, I'm going to put my mind on the side and just experience this and learn from that process. It's very interesting.
I think that this is what you're suggesting, Danielle, is one of the reasons that Boal's work became so interesting to me, because as a teacher working with learners, but also as somebody who was learning to be a teacher, one of the things that I recognized about myself is that I had figured out a lot about how to read and think from learning how to act, which is how to think of subtext, how to think about how my body or my voice might express something beyond the words that are on the page. Like, that was a very powerful lesson for me. And when I came to do my research work to think about it, that was one of the things that I was really interested in bringing. And it seemed like Boal had already thought that through. Like, he'd already figured out how this works in some way. And so I was really grateful to him in that regard, because it married a lot of the ideas that I sort of understood in my body and maybe in my head as well, but I hadn't been able to figure out necessarily how to translate into practice.
This relates to what you talk about, the cultural shift that you went through in approaching Boal. You talk about your own mind shift, entering Boal's use of theater as democratized space where spect actors develop community awareness and social action. I wonder if you might expand a bit on your experiences related to this mind shift of going from more traditional theater, which Boal actually walks through in the first half of his book, the theoretical work, going from the ancient Greek theater all the way into to Brecht and to modern times. What was your transition like?
Well, there were moments in my life when I was younger when I was very interested in what I understood to be theater at the time, and I was very interested in the idea of performance, and I was very interested in the ego that goes along with acting and getting cast and all the pieces of that. But by the time I came to Boal's work later in my life, those things were they had less appeal to me, and I was much more interested in the sort of the social aspects of theater, less in the performance, more in the social aspects of it, in terms of how people related to each other, what happened when a group of people who didn't know each other well at all got together and wanted to make something good, and as a result of that intention were able to put aside their sort of individual ego in some ways and come together and create something beautiful or lasting or lovely or a nice performance. So that's what was really interesting to me at that moment. I was less interested in sort of like being a really good actor and having other people recognize that about me. And I was much more interested in the processes that actors involve themselves in to ultimately create whatever the art is that they're working to make. And so because that was sort of an interest at that moment, when I found Freire and then when I found Boal and then other folks who have thought about his work in expanded ways, that really connected with that notion of sort of the group work, the social dynamics, the possibility of that becoming its own important process. And when I began to think like that, it really changed my idea about what theater could be. And then Boal, of course, just confirmed a lot of what I was thinking, and of course expressed it in ways that I would never have been able to express it.
I don't know if you're watching the series The Night Of, but we've been really into this lately, and it's pretty fascinating to watch this play. I mean, not just with this show, but with a lot, but between the individuals as nodes within systems and individuals with kind of a free choice motive, how environments form individual choice, but at the same time, the moral imperative within, how we as observers can imagine the different routes a story could take with each character's choice. I think this would make incredible work for participatory theater. As you designed the project, how did you think about this idea of what you call the consciousness has a potential to generate change, that students need to recognize the oppression within their system, especially when the oppression could be largely self-imposed?
So the teacher that I was working with in this particular project had that sort of question in mind for her classroom. So I should say, like, of course, Boal's work is always is grounded in the community of folks that you're working with. So in my thinking about designing that project, my questions for the teacher were about her own interests, her own intentions, what she understood about her own classroom, her own students, what she thought she would benefit from, what she thought the students would benefit from, and then ultimately asking them the same kinds of questions. So my role was pretty different from the way that I often thought about my role as an educator even. So this sort of harkens back to this idea of what it is to be an actor performer, what it is to be a teacher. So in this case, I was much more interested in becoming a part of the system as much as was possible, as much as they would allow me in those, in the short amount of time that we had together, but also not getting in the way of the work that they were already doing as individuals and also as a group of students in a classroom working together. So those are things that were important because of the process that we were working on, and those are things that I think are somehow connected to the idea that you're talking about here, where each student was an individual, each student was also connected to somebody else in the classroom. The teacher was an individual, but she was also connected to her students and to the larger system in which she was working. I think all those things were there. And what we were attempting to do, and I don't know how successful it was at sort of this macro level. But what we were attempting to do was to help all of us think in more conscious ways about those realities and what they meant for each individual student who was in that space, and how that he or she would be able to manage or navigate this space so that ultimately they could feel that they'd been successful in doing the work they were being asked to do.
I'm going to jump in with another. In other writings, you talk about your experience with readers' theater, and you mention a little bit about how Theater of the Oppressed is quite different from the normal approach to readers' theater. As I've read through Boal and closer, in the back of my mind I was kind of cataloging where I feel like I've come close to Theater of the Oppressed-like activities. I found several dramatizing passages from performance that culminate in a symposium discussion, photo shoots where students portray strong emotions of characters, and that's usually where the conflict of the story arises, preloading critical dialogues where students have listening goals before the listening, and then they debate with their partners, having students process content through fantasy narratives. Through a teacher's lens, we're always looking to appropriate, to move toward the adjacent possible. And participatory theater feels ripe for fusing into our Readers and Writers Workshop model. Do you think this is possible? I mean, can it become basically the Readers and Writers Workshop? Can it become the Readers Theater? Or do you think that we'll water it down so much and misconstrue it that it's better to leave it as kind of a separate intervention activity?
That is a really interesting question. And so here's what I would say about Theater of the Oppressed, and I think that here's what Boal would have said, and I think here's what other people who think deeply about his work would say about it as well. I think he would say that we're not doing Theater of the Oppressed work unless there is a political or socially conscious goal. And so I think he would recognize that a lot of the strategies and techniques and exercises and games that he somehow adapted for his work are easily adaptable in the kinds of ways that you're talking about, Chris. Like, we could just go, oh, we could pick that particular kind of image exercise and we could use that for this particular reading that we're working on, and that would definitely help the students have a new experience of that particular reading. They might understand the character in a new way. They might understand a theme in a way that they had missed it before. But I don't think that Boal would want us to think of that work as Theater of the Oppressed, because it does not necessarily have a liberatory underpinning. It could, but it's not necessarily there. And unless we were helping the students think much more strategically about what it is to live in a liberatory way, what it is to be democratized, I think he would caution us against calling the work that we're doing Theater of the Oppressed, because it's situated in a very particular kind of political and social context, and I think he would understand that there are pieces of it that would be easily sort of plucked away and used, but I think he would caution us in that way. And I will just sort of end, because I know we're really close to time in our conversation today, by saying that for me, as somebody coming to his work initially, that felt extraordinarily daunting, and I felt like I was incapable, perhaps not the right person, to do the kind of work that he was doing. It felt way beyond what I was aware of, what I was used to, what I was accustomed to, or what I even understood. And so it was only through doing a lot of workshops with him and with other people that I was able ultimately to get to the point to do this project, that, like the one that you read about and that's in the book, where I was like, okay, there are ways of thinking about consciousness raising that build on the work that he's doing, but that may only be some small aspect of Theater of the Oppressed. And in those moments, and this is we did talk about this with the students there, in those moments it becomes important to help students delineate the differences there, because he would want, I think, the work to have, well, he wouldn't want, it's necessary in Boal's mind that the work have a liberatory foundation. And if it doesn't, it's something else. It's theater-based, but it's not necessarily Theater of the Oppressed.
Anyone else want to comment before we allow Toby to go on his way?
Yeah, I'll just say one thing on that as somebody who works a lot with educators and who I think appropriates these techniques in ways that people might not call theater of the oppressed, because I agree with you that the term is highly specific, right? But for me, what I always come back to in this work is sort of the democratization of the classroom space, right? And that something as simple as standing in a circle can be a radical act in certain kinds of classrooms. Something as simple as the way that we use our bodies to collaborate and participate. Everybody can't talk at once, but everybody can make a physical shape at once. And so I think there's something really powerful about that, and I think that that's potentially a way that this work can live on in contexts that are maybe not as politically charged as the ones that the work originated in.
Yeah, Toby, one of the questions I asked, which I think was a little bit hard, misconstrued, was like the role of joker and the role of facilitator, and having that objective very explicit. And I was reaching confusion, and basically on what you just kind of clarified was this idea that some of these acts can be very liberating, and they are addressing an oppression. School systems can be an oppression in themselves. But I guess not having that be the driving objective the students are after, because I was sort of asking like, well, what if you were driving at some content and critical thinking pieces, and in the reflections, kids came to realize that they really needed each other to, reach these common goals, or that, my individual attitude can make a big change on the community. So they might be coming to those liberatory acts, but they may not. If that's not the driving question or force of the activity from the beginning, I guess we would have to call it more of just a participatory theater act or whatever.
I think so, and maybe this little story will help make this clear, because it helped me a lot. So I did a workshop with Boal in New York City on invisible theater. So I don't know how much you know about invisible theater, but in Boal's world, invisible theater was a scene that was performed in a community that somehow brought to the fore an issue that community had, but nobody was aware necessarily that they were involved in a scene. And so there are all sorts of that's scary to me. That felt very scary to me. And I knew that when we went to New York to do the workshop with Boal, that he was definitely going to have us do scenes, and he was going to have us go out and perform these scenes in some sort of public space, because that's the idea, to create a dialogue about whatever the issue is. And I was really concerned about it. I ended up having a really deep experience, and actually a fun experience, creating a scene for dialogue, and I worked with several other people in the workshop, and we did something that I think we felt pretty good about ultimately. But when we all came back and started to process it, and people came back, sort of on the high of they'd done something really interesting, and they wanted to talk about that, and Boal listened to everything that we were saying, and he commented and appreciated, and then he also cautioned. And the caution was that what we did was an exercise, and it was a good exercise, but it was not a movement. It was not releasing people from their oppression, because there was no way of doing that. And the only way that could have, with one scene, with one moment, with one dialogue. And his way of talking about it, and this made so much sense to me and was so helpful in clarifying the work for me, he said the only way that could have happened is if we had had one issue that we were working on that was really important to New York City, and there were people all over New York City who were having this dialogue at the same moment, in the same time, because that's when there would be the possibility of serious change, when there are many, many people talking about this. But us doing this one scene, we did a scene in a department store, like that, it's not that it had no effect, but that was not the work. That was an exercise that ultimately might lead us to the work if we knew more about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, in fact, it just reminds me of a conversation I was having with Danielle a few months ago at the conference in Lima. She was talking about it's the rehearsal for the revolution. It's not the revolution. It's just rehearsing the mindsets and some of the methods for it, the thinking around it, but it's not the real thing.
Yeah, I want to
go ahead.
say something about that? I did invisible theater with my students last 2 years ago, and I'm going to do it. I'm in the process of planning it with my students now. And I think with them, the maximum learning experience is understanding that theater could be a tool for change, and they are agents of change, and how much power they have in the world. Like, even if they just perform in front of one person and they might not notice it was a play, it gave them the understanding that they have the power to do something. So it changed their mindsets, and it helped them understand, okay, I'm a person, I can do something for this world, and theater is just another tool that I have to do this. So it was powerful for the students in that learning environment. That's it.
Toby, I want to thank you for spending the time with us out of your schedule. I know I left a lot of questions on there that went unanswered, but I have explored quite a few of your readings and recommend anyone else that listens to this, if they want to explore more. Beyond the book, Toby has several other publications in academic journals, and some of them are behind the academic firewall, but if you can get creative, there's usually a way to get access to those as well. But it's very eye-opening and very interesting to see some of your tech integrations, which I think feed into a lot of the same stream, which activate a lot of this kind of thinking, which wouldn't be labeled theater of the press, but a lot of the mechanics that you've gone through on the way to writing this book as well. Everyone else, I'm going to disconnect now so we can let Toby go. If anyone wants to stay online for another minute or so, we can chat a little bit. Thank you.